Well, good afternoon. It is right now 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, British summertime. But this is both a live stream and a podcast that was been asked that I would produce for the European Leaders Learning Center. And that's the subject that they wanted me to speak on. I thought, well, let's do this for our live stream too, is what did I learn from Loren Cunningham? Now, as I'm recording this for the ELLC, Loren, I've been in touch with Darlene in the last couple of days, and Loren is sharper than ever mentally, no pain, and so he's way past the point at which the doctors thought that his sharpness would suffer a lot, and that he'd have a lot of pain. But at this particular time here in July, what is it, July 21st, his energies are declining, but he is clearer than ever. And so it's a good time to say these are a few things. I learned a lot more than I'm going to be able to say in these 25 minutes or so. But here are some important lessons. I want to say again that this is available on a wide variety of platforms with YouTube and my website, which is lynngreen.net. Please go there, lynngreen.blog, whatever you want. And because there are a lot of other resources there, and I'll keep adding to those resources on a regular basis. And of course, these are my views. But these are my views in relation to Loren, whom I've known for, what it would be, 54 years. Yeah, just 54 years this month. Actually, I met him 57 or 8 or 9 years ago. Anyway, it was 1964 when he spoke at our church, but I was too young to go on the outreach that summer. My sister went. And then I ended up, and here's one of the main things I learned from Loren in this little story, I ended up giving my life to the Lord, for the first time really giving my life to the Lordship of Jesus when I was 21. And my sister and brother-in-law were on their way back from a Bible college because they got a Bible college instead of the other things they were planning after they'd done an outreach summer with YWAM in 1964, which I think it was the biggest outreach to that date and kind of was a real growth point for YWAM at the time. And they'd gone and completed a Bible college, came back to my hometown, and we spent the day together the day after I had given my life to the Lord. And they said, why don't you join us and come to YWAM? And I really was not inclined to do that because I was about to enter my senior year of university in Colorado and to finish an engineering degree. And anyway, after giving a number of reasons why I couldn't do it, I said, God, if you solve these problems, then I will do it. And God solved those problems, and I ended up going. So what I arrived to after a journey fraught with the unexpected and getting lost and all the rest, what I arrived to was a real illustration of Loren and Dar and their pioneering, trusting God, sharing the load of responsibility, the gifts that they have. So I arrived in Lausanne, Switzerland, and couldn't find where they were because they didn't have a physical address because they were just renting a place, and they had only just recently rented it. But here's the deal. God had spoken to them to start a school in Switzerland, and they ran the first shorter school of evangelism in a place that they knew would only be temporary. And when they were seeking God, they felt like God said to land in Lausanne, put roots down in Lausanne. Well, they didn't have a place, and they didn't have any money towards buying a place either. So when I arrived, they were in Lausanne. The way we found each other is they had rented a post office box in Lausanne, Switzerland, and I had been writing to that address a couple of times, and so I ended up not able to find a street address for them, but camping out under that box it was amazing that the Swiss postmaster let me sleep on the floor there. I didn't sleep there very long, but after an hour or so of me falling into a deep sleep because of being jet lagged, Loren woke me up and took me back to YWAM, which was what? Well, it was a small family house about 3 or 4 kilometers outside of the center of Lausanne, just outside of the fringe of Lausanne, in a little place called Charles-Tagobay. It was lovely. I was so glad to be there. But it was just a small family home. And it was full of people, and more teams were coming in, and so tents were being put out in the backyard. And when I woke up after the first good night's sleep in a long time, I found that Loren had called us together, and he'd said, "We feel like God wants us to be here. So could you please just go on prayer walks around the area, go by 2s and 3s, and just go prayer walk this area. We think this is the right area, and see if you can find anything that might do as a training center for us, at least for the lecture phase, and actually for the next few days too, because we've got all these teams coming back in from other parts of Europe, and we need a place to do the end of summer reports." Now, do you get that? The implications of that. They were moving on the word of the Lord to a town that they felt God had said. They had no way of finding a place. They didn't have their eyes on a single property, but they felt they were in the will of God. More than that, they admitted that to us. And I remember not being particularly disturbed by that I'd come into a training center where there was no center, where I'd come to spend 14 months of my life, and there was no place to spend that 14 months at this point. And I wasn't perturbed because they weren't perturbed. They were obeying God, and they knew that God would provide. So we went around, and I think many of us saw the same building. It was about, half a mile away from where the little house where we were staying. And it was a hotel that had been closed down called the Hotel Gulf. And I think a guy named Dennis Kiviak had seen it first, and I wasn't aware of that. So when I walked by it with the person I was praying with, I think it named Eloise, we were praying with it. Well, maybe this could do. And so Loren subsequently went to the owner of that, lived adjacent to it, asked if we could rent it for a while. And within like 2 or 3 days of my arrival, we were there taking off the shutters and opening them up and taking down all the sort of mothballs that had been put into place, cleaning up the kitchen, and finding what worked and what didn't work. Been closed for a while. And that's where we started our school. And that's still the Lausanne base today. And much more. Because as we put roots down, through Joy Dawson in the next year, I think, she had a clear word to claim more land. And we walked around praying and claiming more land from that area. And now we have more land, and a lot more buildings have been put up on the additional land. And that Lausanne base is a major training center in Europe. So I learned by illustration, not by teaching. I learned that you can trust God to speak to you, and when you move on what God has said, He will provide. And I learned that Loren and Lynn Cunningham hear God's voice, and that is such a foundational thing in Youth with a Mission. So I learned that on my first day of arriving, and of course relearned and relearned and relearned, because it just was a part of everything we did. Lord, what are you saying? And Joy Dawson came with the steps of intercession, where you wait on God, you ask for Him to convict you of anything that might hinder Him speaking to you, and then you listen and you pray out what God says. And those are just foundational things that were built into Loren and Darlene from the very first time I was there. But you notice that they also shared the responsibility and the task at hand with all of us. I mean, very few leaders would in any way admit that they didn't have a place. But they were just matter of fact about it. We're trusting God to provide a place. Now, will you guys ask the Lord to show you where it is. Go find it. That's amazing, isn't it? Yeah, so that was really significant. And then there was something else about that. See, my background had been in a pretty large church in a small town. The town was, 20,000 in the town proper and a bit more with outlying population. But we had a church of over 1,000 people, which was big for that town. And in that particular tradition and that denomination, ministers, traveling evangelists, traveling musicians and all they all had a real stage personality. And they were, well, it was kind of celebrity culture. If you were the minister or pastor or you were one of these visiting speakers, I was kind of reactionary against things like that at the time. And when the visiting evangelist in his white suit and white shoes would show up, I just thought, I never want to be in full-time Christian ministry. And because it all seemed quite, well, it was pretend. There was a personality there that wasn't really them. You realize that it was more of an act than anything else when you got around that person outside the pulpit. And I thought, no, even though I wasn't a believer very much that time, I still was sort of reacting against things which are in any way hypocritical or unreal. That was not Loren. It was not Darlene. When we moved into that old hotel, they lived in the same size rooms as all the other people who were married, and we who were single lived in similar sized rooms. We didn't have ensuite bathrooms. They did. That was the only difference. They lived like us. And when we went on the road for outreach, we were a school of less than 25, a couple more people. One of Loren's relatives, his older sister and brother-in-law, and their two kids at that time who were sort of 5 or 7 years old. When we went on the road in several old Volkswagen vans, Loren and Dar were with everybody else. We all slept in tents, and they slept in a tent. And they ate the food we ate, and they didn't take off and go stay in hotels. They didn't have a nicer car where they could travel in more comfort. They were amongst us, and they were setting the DNA, the identity of Youth with a Mission in that process. I don't think they were consciously trying to set a DNA or anything. They were just being who they were and who they are, which is they don't consider themselves to be of greater significance than anybody else. And I think it's important. Some of you watching this won't really know them well. I know them very well. Lived with them, traveled with them over several years, and then have stayed in their home every year for decades. But I know them well enough to know that they could easily have just played life a little differently, and they could have been amongst the really, really well-known Christian celebrities. And they're just not. They have avoided that. They also have avoided the temptation that well-known Christian personalities face, which is to become really prosperous off their ministry. And you've seen, I've certainly seen many ministries at least have a question mark over them, if not being undermined by the reality that the person at the head of it becomes a whole lot more prosperous than they let on. And they don't want to tell you they've got a private jet, but they do. And now, not many of them have private jets, but you know what I mean. They have more goods than they want to be known publicly. That was never the case with Loren and Dar, and they did not seek celebrityhood. One thing Loren did say to me that kind of related to that, and this was an important lesson to learn. When I was still mid-20s, but things were beginning to grow, and it was obvious that here in Wyoming, England, there was probably a significant future ahead of us. He said, Lynn, live as though you're famous. And what he meant was this: you're not famous, and you may never be famous, That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the day might come when journalists looking for something to pick on, people who might have some reason to want to bring YWAM down or bring you down, will be looking for something that you have not been transparent about. And therefore, it's really important for you to live as though you are under the scrutiny of investigative journalists or other interested parties at any given time. In other words, keep really good accounts, and don't you or Marty be the primary bookkeepers. You got to have people who are not your relatives, where there's no conflict of interest, looking after the finances. Remember, Jesus didn't seem to look after the finances. And that really helped because he said, be sure and make tax returns. Even though you're way under the threshold for having to pay taxes, make your tax returns every year. Because when a journalist writes that Mr. Green has not filed income taxes for the last 12 years, they don't add because he was under the threshold. They imply that Mr. Green is evading taxes. Actually, something related to that came up, in the last 2 or 3 years. As you may know, David Cunningham is a film director and has produced several commercial films. And a journalist or a newspaper was trying to get some dirt on David and on Loren, and they couldn't come up with anything. But what they said implied something was hidden, but really it didn't say anything. It said, we contacted Youth with a Mission who do not keep records of how Mr. Loren Cunningham and Mr. David Cunningham are compensated. Well, that's because they're not compensated. They don't get any payments from YWAM. But you see the clever way that the reporter or journalist wrote it up. It seems like they've taken money, but it's not recorded, it's not counted. Well, no. What the journalist said was true, but what it implied was a lie. So that was an important lesson to learn. There were 2 or 3 lessons sort of wrapped up in that little story. But there was another lesson that I learned that is really at the heart of Youth with a Mission as well. And you find that many times the principles and the values that we emphasize in Youth with a Mission are centered around the issue of the priesthood of all believers, that we do not create organizational hierarchies. We've really worked not to do that. We did for a while, and then we really had to backtrack. Now, there are natural differences of influence that people have, so you can't say there are no hierarchies. They're just not organizational or official. But there's no doubt that when you look at people in Youth with a Mission, at the top of the influence chart sit Loren and Dar. Why? Not because we have given them a title. I mean, they are founders by definition. They started it. But not because they have some important title, but because, well, who they are commands respect. And all of us who know them never take what they say lightly. But neither do we take it as the gospel truth. Let me illustrate that. This is such an important thing in Youth with a Mission, because there's a natural tendency for the relational hierarchies of just influence based on who people are. There's a natural tendency for us to solidify those into organizational hierarchies where the people at the top have the final word. Not just more persuasive voices because of their character and their history, but they have a position which says, no, they're in charge. And of course, that's the way it is in governmental hierarchies. That's the way it is in business hierarchies. That's the way it is in educational hierarchies. But it was never meant to be that way in religious or Christian hierarchies. That's not what Jesus set up. That's not what he left with his disciples. He left a team, and he didn't leave one person in charge. Some people like to read it as if Peter was put in charge, but you just keep reading the New Testament. It's clear that none of those disciples was the final word. They worked as a body. So here's a little story. Quite an amazing one for me. Let's see how I'm doing for time. Okay, I can tell this in 5 minutes, I think, and then we'll be done. But I got a phone call from Loren. I guess it was in the late 70s, and he was in Switzerland, and Joy Dawson was there. and my brother-in-law Don Stevens was there, and we had purchased the MV Victoria ship, and we were trying to get the ship ministries underway, and it was going slowly. And Loren phoned to say, Lynn, we feel like we're supposed to have a time of fasting and prayer and a fasting sleep, an all-night prayer meeting, and we think you should be part of it. So I said, okay. And I did manage to get a ticket and get over to Lausanne, Switzerland, and up into Villars-Tercillon, which is just above Chalet-Togo Bay, and where Don and Dion Stevens, my sister, were living at the time. And we had some fellowship, and then we began to pray, and we did have an all-night prayer meeting. At the end of it, and we were praying for the ship ministry and YWAM as a whole and what was God saying to us. And at the end of it, there was a question, who should lead the ship ministry? And we waited on God for a while, and the three of them all felt that I was to lead the ship ministry. And I didn't have a clear word one way or the other, but I was excited about the adventure of it, having not thought it through very much. But I did think, I like a challenge, and this was a big challenge, and it was a huge challenge. And I thought, well, if God has this for me, then he'll give me the grace, and this will be a major responsibility and a growth for me in Christ Jesus. So I went back to Marty, back in England, and I said what the outcome of the prayer meeting was, and she just was not pleased about that. But she said, I don't, because we had 4 small children then, and a non-commissioned ship with guardrails that weren't really built to stop children from falling overboard and all that. It was not really a place where she looked forward to raising 4 kids. But she said, if God wants us to go, then I'll feel right about it before we go. And if not, he'll tell us. Wonderful to have a spouse like that. And that's the way she's always been. So we started making plans, and we were only a few weeks away from moving when I went to a conference, the subject of which was restoring the prophetic to the church. I was quite interested in it. At the end of the first meeting, a man who was not the speaker came to the podium at the front, and he said, now, I'm not here to be a speaker, but God sent me here, and the brothers who who are hosting this meeting know me well, and they can vouch for me. I'm here because God gave me a word for somebody. And he was from Tennessee or Kentucky. And he said, I've flown 6,000 miles here because God gave me a word to deliver to somebody who's here. And I knew what the word was, but I didn't know who it was. And I watched you all as you came through the door. And as he was going through this, I thought, it's going to be me. And sure enough, there were 400 people there. And he pointed me out and said, it's for you. Come out front. And essentially what he said to me is, you have a plan. It's going to have you leaving this country soon. It's about starting or launching a new ministry. He came down off the platform and spoke to me. He said, this plan is a relatively new plan. It's grown very quickly. It's now pretty advanced in your heart, and it's not God's plan. He said, in the word that God gave me, it was partly a vision, and God gave me a vision like in your heart, a plan growing like a mushroom. It wasn't there, and then suddenly it was, and it grew fast, and I saw the sword of the word of the Lord come down into your heart and cut that plan off like a mushroom. Well, that was a really difficult word for me to hear, because my heart was kind of set on this by this time. But I knew God was in it. I just knew. So I went back home, of course, told Marty, and she was greatly relieved. Now, there's Loren, Joy, Don, all with this word that I should lead the ship. What do I do? Well, only what I could do. By this time, I think Don and Joy had gone their way, and Loren was still there. Contacted Loren and said, here's what happened, Loren. And Marty and I just know God has spoken to us. And he said, okay, that's fine. Did you get that? The priesthood of all believers. I might have been just turning 30 by that time. So I've been in YWAM a while. But he respected the word of the Lord to me, even though he felt a different thing. Now that's remarkable. It means that it illustrated to me an important principle, the priesthood of all believers, that elders amongst us have significant influence, and they are sounding boards for wisdom, and they are meant to be asking good questions and checking things out, but they do not have the final word over what God is saying to the individual. And I know at times that gets people in trouble, and people go off and do things that really wise counsel would have helped them avoid. But it's better that we have those errors, because we always learn from our errors, than it is to put people in positions of growing priestly authority, because there is no priest above us within the body of Christ. It's the priesthood of all believers. So these are a few things that I've learned from Loren Cunningham after, 54 years, I guess, of living with them at times, traveling with them at times, seeing them up close, Loren and Dara's parents, and they still, after all this time, are a couple whom I deeply respect, and I don't know anybody in the world I would rather follow than Loren and Darlene Cunningham, because of some of these things that I learned from them. Well, I hope that's helpful for you. Those are a few things, and I could go on and on and on, but there's not time. But thanks for watching.